Luans Network wasn't a former rebel cell in the traditional sense, as it wasn't a group that sat in a base together and planned attacks from there in a military-esque way. Rather, they can be described as more of a spy network of several individuals with different skill sets. The main man was Luthens, who had built a network of different loyalists around him to operate in the shadows before the Rebel Alliance had even put together a mailing list. What made Luthens so special was that he wasn't at the front line, rather lived on Coruscant as a high-end antique dealer who was deeply entwined in the upper class of Coruscant's politicians and power players. Behind this facade that is very reminiscent of Palpatine's facade during the prequels, he was a master puppeteer, coordinating attacks, instigating chaos, and supporting individual rebel groups with weapons and information on the Empire. Luthens Network recruited from all walks of society, with his closest confidant being his daughter, Kleya, who had absolutely adopted his pragmatic ways. He had connections with rich senators like Mon Mothma, whose family wealth he used to finance the individual cells. He had connections with loyalists, dedicated to the cause like Andor, Vel, and Cinta, who he used as his soldiers on the front line. He even had a mole in the deeper echelons of the Imperial Security Bureau, with Lonnie Young, who fed him information on the Empire's actions. This was all to serve his primary goal: spark rebellion across the galaxy, provoke the Empire into crushing down even harder on the people so that they'd be forced to fight back and keep lighting the fire of rebellion until it couldn't be contained by the Empire anymore. He believed the only way to unify the galaxy against the Empire was to make the Empire worse, more violent, more repressive, more obvious in its tyranny. He fed the ISB just enough to make them paranoid and wanting to increase surveillance even more, let small rebel groups die so larger ones could rise, and even sacrificed other rebel groups like Anto Kger's, despite knowing they'd walk into a trap if it served the greater strategy. If one of his subordinates would prove to become a liability to himself or the greater plan, he wouldn't hesitate to take them out. If it meant that civilians had to die, like in the Gorman massacre, and manipulate the local rebel cell to stand up, fully aware that the Empire might lash out, he'd happily go with it. Every sacrifice on his chessboard served to recruit more and more people to their cause against the Empire. As is a famous quote from Attack on Titan, "To rise above monsters, you have to abandon your humanity." And Luthen embraced that fully. In his own words, he was condemned to use the tools of his enemy to defeat them. And he succeeded brilliantly. Luthens Network was directly responsible for key rebel victories like the Aldhani heist, which was the very first major victory by any rebel group against the Empire. The heist showed the greater galaxy that the Empire wasn't invincible, and also forced the Empire to tighten its grip to control everything even more, leading even more people to stand up against the Empire's oppression. His network also was key in helping the Gorman Resistance to stand up against the Empire. These events led to the massacre that ignited the fire of the unified Rebel Alliance, as Mon Mothma saw that event as a turning point, which led to her famous speech against the Empire. Still, his methods were very controversial, even among his allies. Cassian Andor had several issues with the morality of Luthens as well as his own actions. Mon Mothma, who did work with him quite closely, was still fearful that Luthen might at any time see the need to discard her and silence her if he were to see her as a loose end. Lonnie Young would experience Luthen's ruthlessness firsthand, being killed after delivering the Death Star intel to Luthen despite having been promised safe passage off Coruscant. Due to this, when the Rebel Alliance ultimately formed itself on Yavin, Luthen wasn't really part of it, and was talked about badly, being put into the same drawer as someone like Saw Gerrera, a radicalist that didn't share the same idealist values that the Alliance wanted to uphold. The final act of Luthens Network was the discovery of the Death Star before its completion, and giving the rebellion the hint of Galen Erso's name that would set the events in Rogue One. Unfortunately, he would never see his work completed after killing himself to escape Imperial custody. But his actions, despite the lack of idealism, were all necessary for the rebellion to form itself. In that way, he succeeded absolutely, and his ways of fighting against the Empire live on in his daughter Kleya. But his name and contribution to the rebels would be forgotten and not spoken about by the eventual victors. The partisans were one of the earliest rebel cells to rise after the fall of the Republic. They were formed from the remnants of the Onderon Resistance during the Clone Wars, and were led by the same leader, Saw Gerrera, who transformed his fight against the Separatists into a fight against the Empire. What made the partisans stand out was that they made no distinction between military and civilian targets, as they were well known to use rather morally questionable tactics to achieve their targets. This all stemmed from Gerrera's primary and single obsession, the total destruction of the Empire, no matter the cost. This meant that he didn't care about what he saw as useless things like diplomacy or public opinion, only results that would hurt the Empire. Thus, the partisans didn't shy away from terrorist tactics, including bombings and public assassinations in highly populated areas. They were also known to torture prisoners and be very skeptical towards any outsiders, rather shooting them than risk them being a potential Imperial spy. Saw Gerrera also would make sure to silence any dissent, and was quick to eliminate anyone within his ranks who questioned his methods or loyalty. Paranoia ran very deep in the partisans, as Saw trusted almost no one, and as the war dragged on, he became increasingly isolated and unstable. However, despite their ruthlessness, other rebel group leaders like Luthen Rael often involved them in their communication, and chose to work alongside them as they were still a valuable resource and did have the overall same goal in mind. But as the Rebel Alliance started to take shape, the leaders distanced themselves from the partisans as their extreme methods didn't fit the way the Alliance wanted to portray themselves. All ties were severed when Mon Mothma, right before the declaration of the official Rebel Alliance, made an official resolution to not allow the partisans to join the Alliance. Saw Gerrera responded by calling her weak and ineffective, calling her out on not understanding what the sacrifice is that it would take to take down the Empire. The relationship between the Alliance and the partisans were henceforth in a terrible state and beyond repair. During the events of Rogue One, Cassian Andor even mentions to Jyn that should they try to even land close to the partisans' base, they'd get shot before being able to walk through the door, if it weren't for a familiar face. Despite their glaring flaws, they were still a constant thorn in the eyes of the Empire, waging guerrilla campaigns from Kashyyyk to Jedha, destroying facilities and killing Imperial personnel. Tarkin, as early as right after the formation of the Empire, tried to kill Gerrera by sending Clone Force 99 out to try and eliminate him, but failed to catch him on every occasion. Gerrera made sure that the partisans were operational from several different bases scattered across the galaxy. This followed the logic that should one of them be wiped out, the others could keep going. By 1 BBY, Gerrera was operating out of Jedha and launched attacks on the Imperial facilities there that were mining for kyber crystals. Jedha would be the last planet for Gerrera, as the Death Star destroyed the planet's surface and killed him with it. The leadership of the partisans would go to his former second-in-command, Benthic, who continued his brutal methods. A splinter group from the partisans, called the Dreamers, who were said to be even more radical, also formed after the death of Gerrera, but was eliminated by the Empire's Inferno Squad. In the end, the partisans always lived for the dream.
Save the rebellion! Save the dream!
Also, shout out to Moroff, who's kinda always in the background whenever we see the partisans. I just know him due to the 2016 LEGO U-Wing set, and ever since I always gravitate toward this white-furred alien whenever I rewatch Rogue One. Senator Bale Orana of Alderaan was one of the first and essential architects of organized rebellion against the Galactic Empire. The moment Palpatine declared the formation of the New Order at the end of the Clone Wars, Organa knew the Republic was dead. But, on the advice of his friend Padme Amidala, he chose not to speak out publicly. Instead, he played the long game, maintaining the illusion of loyalty to the Empire so he could quietly build the framework of resistance from within. Bale used his wealth and reputation to create several secret resistance networks, quietly recruiting allies to his cause until the time was right for them to reveal themselves. His early recruits included several Jedi survivors like Ahsoka Tano, Kanan, and Ezra, Ramkota, and also Shakti, depending on which of her deaths you see as canon. He also had contacts to several different rebel cells, including the Phoenix Crew, the Celestian Resistance, and the Masasi Group. Although he was aware of Luthen Rael, he chose not to really work with him, as he deemed his methods too radical. He supported several of the rebel cells by providing them with starships, weapons, and intelligence on how to hurt the Empire, all serving the goal to weaken them. He also built a network called the Fulcrum Agents, a spy ring that gathered intel and maintained communication between the isolated rebel cells. Unlike Luthen Rael, though, Bale Orana always tried to uphold his idealistic values, trying to limit civilian casualties and only going after the Empire directly, condemning anyone that wouldn't uphold these values. His network and contacts would eventually merge with the greater Rebel Alliance on Yavin 4, with Bale being one of the main culprits to bring all the cells together under the Alliance flag. He himself would become one of the founding members of the Alliance, sitting on Rebel High Command. Unfortunately, Bale would never live to see the Rebellion's victory against the Empire, as he was likely killed when the Death Star destroyed Alderaan. His daughter Leia would carry on his legacy and eventually be a key player in the Empire's downfall. The Mon Calamari Resistance was created in reaction to the Empire's occupation of Mon Cala. The Empire wanted to take control of their famous technologically advanced shipyards and also gain access to the rare minerals that were present on their planet. The population of Mon Cala and Quarren were thus enslaved and forced into labor at the shipyards after failed negotiation attempts for a peaceful resolution. The resistance movement at first was rather passive, as they tried to resist in small manners by sabotaging equipment and engaging in protests. A certain Jial Akbar, which is a name that should be very familiar to everyone, was the leader of these protests and the growing resistance movement. However, the Empire didn't want to tolerate even these small pockets of resistance. To silence them through fear, they bombarded 3 of their floating cities from orbit to break their spirit. However, they didn't expect that this would instead embolden the resistance movement even more. The Mon Cala and Quarren started open warfare against them under the leadership of Admiral Akbar and Admiral Raddus. They eventually evacuated the entire population by modifying some of their underwater municipal buildings into starships, as well as their general fleet, and joined the forming Rebel Alliance. Akbar and Raddus would become prominent military leaders, sharing their decades of experience with the rebellion, which they lacked severely, and the Mon Cala cruisers would become an important part of the Alliance fleet, as their MC-80 cruisers were the only one to be able to go toe-to-toe with an Imperial Star Destroyer. The Masasi Group was one of the biggest organized rebel cells before the formal creation of the Rebel Alliance. It was led by General Jan Dodonna, a former Republic officer that became disillusioned with the Empire. The group was named after the ancient Masasi ruins on Yavin 4, where they established their hidden base inside one of the old Sith temples, being unaware of the site's dark past. They repurposed Naga Sadow's Great Temple into a fully functional command center. It became the heart of the Masasi Group's operations, a hub of constant activity to prepare their missions against the Empire. What made the Masasi Group particularly effective and successful were its elite starfighter squadrons, most notably their X-Wings and their Y-Wing starfighters. These starfighters would also come to form the backbone of the later Alliance fleet and play a role in several key battles. The Masasi Group was also present during the Battle of Atollon, one of the first major rebel battles alongside the Phoenix Rebel Cell, where they were almost wiped out by the fleet of Grand Admiral Thrawn. Later on, they'd answer the call of Phoenix Squadron to attempt to help destroy the TIE Defender program on Lothal. Several other rebel cells, like the Spectre Ghost Crew, would go on to merge with the Masasi Cell, becoming part of the ever-growing rebellion on Yavin 4. Afterward, with the formation of the Rebel Alliance, the group was officially absorbed into the wider alliance to restore the Republic, and Yavin 4 was made the official Rebel Alliance base. Dodonna continued to serve in high command as a key strategist, and the Masasi Group was henceforth less of an independent cell, but rather part of the greater collective. The Masasi Group went on to play a pivotal role during the Battle of Scarif, where they'd be instrumental in acquiring the Death Star plans. Their squadrons would later also lead the front during the Battle of Yavin to destroy the first Death Star. The Ghost Crew, officially known as Spectre Cell, was one of the most effective and unpredictable rebel teams in the early days of the fight against the Empire. They operated from the modified VCX-100 light freighter Ghost, and were led by a Jedi named Kanan Jarrus, who survived Order 66, and the Twi'lek Hera Syndulla, an ace pilot and former Resistance fighter from Ryloth. What made them stand out is that for a team of only 6 members, they punched well above their weight, and pulled off feats deemed impossible by any other cell. The other members included Ezra, Zeb, Sabine, and the droid Chopper. They started off on Lothal, where they'd often steal supplies from the Empire or disrupt their operations in small ways, by sabotaging convoys and such. Through that, they slowly became a symbol of resistance against the oppressive Empire. Their crew would later join the Phoenix Rebel Cell, and finally end up joining the Masasi Cell on Yavin 4. Throughout their time, their contribution to the rebellion include, but are not limited to, finding and capturing old Republic Y-Wings, discovering the first B-Wing starfighter prototype and bringing its design into the greater rebel cause, facing off against the Empire's elites like the Grand Inquisitor, Darth Vader, and being the reason for killing aforementioned Grand Inquisitor. They were also crucial for the survival of an early rebel alliance at Atollon, where the combination of Phoenix Cell and the Masasi Group wanted to destroy the TIE Defender factory on Lothal before being intercepted and almost wiped out by Grand Admiral Thrawn. If it wasn't for Sabine saving the day with her Mandalorian starfighters, the Greater Rebellion likely would have ended there. Later, they'd also managed to liberate Lothal from the Empire all on their own, as well as being the reason for Thrawn's disappearance from the known galaxy. Sadly, Ezra and Kanan would later disappear and die respectively, whereas the rest of the crew would be merged into the Masasi Group, and finally, the Greater Rebel Alliance on Yavin 4. Hera would become a key figure and general in the Rebel fleet, and Zeb would also be part of the Alliance, with both of them even surviving the Galactic Civil War. Phoenix Cell was one of the first organized military units within the Rebel movement that actually looked like a real fighting force. Led by Commander Jun Sato, Phoenix Cell operated mostly in the Outer Rim, and was the first Rebel fleet group to coordinate large-scale operations against Imperial targets. They represented the transitional phase between scattered Rebel cells and a unified military front quite well, being part of Bale Orana's effort to coordinate a bigger Rebel cell. While groups like the Ghost Crew were pulling off small missions, Phoenix Cell was already forming bigger objectives, training pilots, and assembling a fleet capable of rivaling the Empire. Clearly wanting to form the backbone against the Empire. The cell had several CR-90 Rebel blockade runners, A-Wing starfighter, as well as 3 Hammerhead corvettes, and a Pelta-class cruiser as their command ship at their disposal. The cell was heavily involved in securing resources like a set of old Y-Wings from a junkyard in deep space for the Masasi Group, as well as escorting Gold Squadron when they had Mon Mothma give the speech to form the Rebel Alliance. Unfortunately, most of the Phoenix Cell would perish during the Battle of Atollon, where their base on Atollon, called Chopper Base, would be destroyed by Grand Admiral Thrawn. Commander Sato also sacrifices himself and his command ship to allow Ezra to escape the Imperial blockade. The remaining members of Phoenix Cell would then join the Masasi Group and later be merged into the Rebel Alliance. As a random side note, Wedge Antilles, Star Wars' most underrated character, was also part of Phoenix Cell at first after defecting from the Imperial Academy. Anto Kger's group was a rebel cell led by Anto Kger, a former fighter with ties to the Confederacy of Independent Systems. Kger planned a major assault on the Spellhouse Imperial Power Station, but his entire operation was compromised from the start. The Imperial Security Bureau had been tipped off to the plan. Thanks to the rebel spy in the ISB, Lonnie Zheng, Luthen Rail actually caught wind of the setup. However, he decided to sacrifice Kger for the greater good, as it would have risked exposing Young, and Luthen didn't want to risk losing an asset as valuable as an informant in the inner circle of the ISB. As a result, Kger and his forces walked into a trap. The ISB was ready, and the entire cell of around 50 men was wiped out during the ambush. Although this group was insignificant to the wider Rebel Alliance, Kger's death showed us how cutthroat the early rebellion had to be in order to operate and survive their founding phases. In the same spirit of Anto Kger's cell comes the Maya Pei Brigade. Unlike Kger, who showed how brutal the early rebellion had to be, Maya Pei's brigade showed us how incompetent and disorganized the early rebellion was. The cell was led by the idealistic Maya Pei, and built on the belief in restoring a democratic republic. But in 4 BBY, the brigade was attacked under unknown circumstances, and while some members survived and fled to Yavin 4, Maya Pei herself vanished. This led the remnants of the brigade to start infighting with each other over who gets the leadership role, with them even opening fire on each other and playing a Star Wars version of rock, paper, scissors to try and determine who would be the new leader. Cassian Andor is briefly captured by these clowns before he manages to escape their custody. Most likely, all of them died on Yavin as their supplies ran out and they were stuck in the forest. Captain Rex was one of the only clones who got his inhibitor chip removed after Order 66, and attempted to free several of his brothers from the grasp of the Empire. The clones were slowly being sorted out and replaced by regular recruits from across the galaxy. Rex tried to gather sympathist and disillusioned clones into a network in an attempt to find Mount Tantiss, a research facility where several clones were being brought to and experimented on. Notable members that eventually join his rebellion are Gregor, Echo, and Hauser. Together, they started to free their clone brothers and relocated them into safe spaces across the galaxy. They also attacked several Imperial facilities to help free their brothers, thus making them a real thorn in the Empire's side. The clone underground force is eventually discovered on their base on Teth, and most of its members aside from Gregor, Echo, Hauser, and Rex are killed. It's not quite clear what Rex did after that, but I'd like to think that several other deserted commanders like Cody, Wolf, and such eventually all met up with Rex, and they kept trying to get clones away from the Empire. Rex, Gregor, and Wolf also went on to help Phoenix Cell in the liberation of Lothal, although they were rather old at that point due to their accelerated aging. Rex himself was the only one to officially join the Rebel Alliance, and he also fought during the Battle of Endor. The Celestian Resistance was founded and led by Senator Garm Bel Iblis, a fierce critic of Palpatine's rise to power. The movement took shape after Bel Iblis was forced into hiding following an assassination attempt. As he was no longer able to use his Senate seat to challenge the Emperor directly, Bel Iblis pivoted to insurgency. He began consolidating local resistance groups across the Celestian sector, transforming small gatherings of dissidents into a full-blown underground network. Early meetings took place in cellars and back rooms, but over time the movement swelled to several thousand members, with cells spread across every major city on Corellia. The structure was cell-based and decentralized. Most members only knew the people in their immediate unit, with only Bel Iblis and a few senior commanders aware of the full scope of the network. As the group grew, so did its capabilities. What started as quiet organizing evolved into direct action. The Resistance launched hit-and-fade raids and sabotage missions, with some Corellian operatives even infiltrating staff at Imperial military bases and feeding intel back to Bel Iblis. He also commanded a small fleet of rebel starships and led multiple assaults on key targets across the sector. Realizing that the Empire couldn't be taken down alone, Bel Iblis pushed for something bigger, a united front across the galaxy. This made his way back to Bale Orana, and eventually Bel Iblis Front would be a founding member of the Alliance. While Bel Iblis would later step away from the Alliance leadership over political differences, his impact on the rebellion wouldn't be forgotten. The Twi'lek Resistance actually began during the Clone Wars, when the Confederacy of Independent Systems invaded Ryloth. Led by Cham Syndulla, the Resistance fought alongside the Republic to free Ryloth from the droid army. They eventually succeeded to liberate Ryloth and drive the Separatists off the planet. But Ryloth's struggle didn't end with the departure of the Separatists. When the Galactic Republic became the Galactic Empire, Ryloth was absorbed under the title of Protectorate, leading the Empire to fortify the planet under the guise of protecting it. A lot of local Twi'leks were enslaved and the planet was mined for its natural resources. Ryloth moved from occupation by the Separatists to occupation by the Empire. Cham thus saw himself forced to keep fighting, founding the Free Ryloth movement to gather former Resistance fighters and local Twi'leks into an armed insurgency. The Free Ryloth movement carried out sabotage missions and attacks on Imperial supply lines, all in hopes of disrupting the Empire. They often made ambushes by using Ryloth's terrain and environment to their advantage. Their movement even once got the chance to take down Emperor Palpatine and Darth Vader. They learned that the Toot Siths were on their way to Ryloth and shot down their ship. However, they survived the crash and then had to fight their way through its dangerous jungle back to safe lines, while the Twi'lek Resistance hunted them down. However, to the detriment of the entire galaxy, they failed killing either of them. When the Rebel Alliance started to form, Cham wanted nothing to do with it, choosing to focus on Ryloth itself. His daughter Hera, on the other hand, would become one of the rebellion's best pilots and leaders. The Celestian Resistance, led by Nien Nunb, was a small rebel cell on the volcanic world of Sullust. Unlike many other cells that formed before the Alliance was formed, the Celestian Resistance was formed after its formation. After operatives from the Alliance arrived on the planet to support the growing movement, they found that all but 4 of the Resistance members had already been imprisoned. But the spark of rebellion had already been set across the galaxy, so the Celestian Resistance started from scratch again, winning the support of everyday citizens on Pinyum by simply talking to them. The Resistance, reduced to 4 members at that point, started to gain wind again. After a Resistance saboteur blew up an Imperial mining facility, the Empire came down hard, raiding homes and safe houses to try and detain the rebels' insurgents. This led to further unrest on the planet, with more and more Celestians finding themselves suffering under the Empire's oppression. Eventually, the Alliance's 61st Infantry, called Twilight Company, would help the Celestian Resistance to devise a plan to get the Empire off the planet. Alongside the Cobalt Laborers Reformation Front, a group of local miners and workers that decided to turn on the Empire, they dug up tunnels to reroute the magma flows into several Imperial facilities. The result was very effective, wiping out the entire Imperial garrison at the capital. With the Empire's garrison at Pinium wiped out, a full-scale uprising kicked off across the city. Twilight Company held the facility, the Resistance took the capital, and the people of Sullust finally had a shot at freedom. In the aftermath, the Celestian Resistance formed an interim government to stabilize the region and prepare for the inevitable Imperial retaliation. Its most prominent member, Nien Numb, would eventually join the Greater Alliance and is also part of the Millennium Falcon crew during the Battle of Endor. Also, he's just the greatest hero character in the 2015 Battlefront. The Kashyyyk Resistance, also known as the Wookiee Underground Movement, was one of the most determined and oppressed anti-Imperial uprisings in the galaxy. Made up almost entirely of Wookiees, this movement fought against the enslavement of their people. The Resistance had its roots in the Clone Wars, when the Wookiees first fought off the Separatist invasion alongside Jedi Master Yoda. But their alliance with the Republic turned into betrayal the moment Order 66 was issued. The clone troopers turned on the Jedi, and the Wookiees almost overnight. What followed was full-scale Imperial occupation and mass enslavement. The Wookiees didn't just accept it. Many of those who escaped captivity fled into the dense jungles of their homeworld, forming guerrilla cells that would become the backbone of the Kashyyyk Resistance. They operated from treetop outposts, used Oevor jet catamarans and other native war vehicles to fight back against the Empire. They also used their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage, as the Empire couldn't really follow them into the dangerous Shadowlands. The Resistance was led at various points by Wookiee figures like Chieftain Tarful, a veteran of the Clone Wars. Tarful would also shortly help Cal Kestis find Eno Cordova. The Resistance also suffered one of the biggest defeats. After a huge uprising, the Wookiees were brutally crushed. Darth Vader personally led the retaliation. Star Destroyers bombarded the surface, entire cities were wiped out, and 200,000 Wookiees were enslaved in a single campaign. A second major uprising a year later ended the same way, with thousands dead or captured. Despite the setbacks, the Resistance never gave up and kept fighting for the confines of Kashyyyk's Shadowlands. After the Battle of Endor, the tide finally turned, with the New Republic Navy handling the Imperial fleet in orbit. The Wookiee Resistance led the liberation of Kashyyyk on the ground. With that, Kashyyyk was finally freed. When all the individual rebel cells eventually combined into the Rebel Alliance, a new leadership structure was necessary. The Rebel High Command consisted of a group of senior leaders and military strategists who coordinated the larger operations of the Rebel Alliance. If Luthen Rail lit the match, and Saw Gerrera fanned the flames, Rebel High Command was the team that tried to organize the wildfire into something vaguely resembling a winning war effort. The most recognizable figures in the group included Mon Mothma, Bale Orana, General Dodonna, Admiral Akbar, Admiral Raddus, and General Draven, names that came to define the initial stages of the rebellion. What made High Command unique was that they tried to balance their ideology and strategy. These former Republic loyalists and political exiles who believed the rebellion had to be more than a war machine. That meant following laws of war, trying to limit civilian casualties, and pushing an image of a noble uprising that could win over neutral systems and inspire defections. Of course, this more structured and ethical approach also came with its limits. High Command often clashed with more radical elements like Saw Gerrera's partisans, and even people like Cassian Andor, who had seen the darker side of the rebellion, struggled to reconcile the idealism of the council chambers with the mess of the front lines. From a military standpoint, Rebel High Command oversaw both ground and space operations. They were the brains behind massive offensives like Scarif and Endor, and coordinated the hit-and-run strategies that allowed the rebellion to survive against a much better-equipped Imperial war machine, eventually leading to the Empire's defeat at Endor. Also, shout out to all these rebel cells, which I won't be going in on detail. The Amidalans, who were founded by Padme's double Sabe on Naboo after her death. The Anklebiter Brigade, who were a group of youngsters stirring it up on Coruscant. Atrevis Resistance Group, who were active in the Atrevis sector and eventually merged with the Alliance. The Bataan Insurgents, who fought against Admiral Thrawn and were completely wiped out. Christophsis Insurgents, who were based on Christophsis and ran operations against the Empire. The Cloud Riders wanted revenge on Crimson Dawn and also fought the oppression of the Empire. They also had ties with Saw Gerrera's partisans. Ramkota Militia were a group of elite soldiers under the leadership of Jedi Master Kota. And finally, Sapanza's gang, Tatooine Rebel Cell, which didn't fight the Empire but rather against Jabba. This should be most of the more prominent rebel cells. Let me know if I missed any, and until next time.